Delighted to be back in the E-FWD studio with Alastair Bisset, Head of Decommissioning at the North Sea Transition Authority, for a quick chat. Alastair, you can't move for talk of UK economy at the moment in a very political year. And at the centre of that conversation is the North Sea and what happens with the energy sector. In amongst all of that noise and debate, what are you and the team focused on delivering in 2024?
Yeah, thanks, Owen. As you say, there's a lot going on, and decommissioning is a word that keeps getting mentioned, and rightly so. There's a huge amount ahead of us in the industry, and for 2024 in particular. Decommissioning is a 20 billion cost or 20 billion opportunity in the coming decade. So in terms of the work that operators need to do, in terms of the work that's available for the supply chain, it's really a huge opportunity and something we have to harness right now. There's a lot of challenges there, but I think that first and foremost, we view it as an opportunity and an exciting one. One thing I would pick up on is, for net zero and for the transition, we need decommissioning to happen. It's a real stepping stone to decarbonisation. And so if we think of energy transition as a journey, and I know through E-FWD, there's a big focus on North Sea 2, if you like, and that kind of mindset and, a lot of energy. And I think for decommissioning, for me, it's the first step of that journey. It's not the end of a journey, but a first step.
Tell me about these challenges you're facing in moving forwards in decommissioning in this market. What's the biggest one you face at present?
Well, I think, where shall I start? There are a lot. I mean, there's a few I could touch on, let's go with priorities, people, and then I'll come to P&A.
Okay.
So in terms of priorities, I'd see that as twofold. There's priorities right here in the basin and the sector in terms of competition for funding from operators and developers, whether it's energy transition projects, whether it's aging assets and infrastructure, or whether it's looking at decommissioning. And a lot of those need funding and investment. And so there is the competition for the funding in order to enable and execute that work. There's also the competition with abroad. There are huge global markets in our industry, and decommissioning is featuring more and more heavily in those. So in terms of the supply chain focus, in terms of some of the expertise that exists here in the basin, there are more and more opportunities abroad that, whilst we want to be able to export those capacities, we still want to execute the work here in the basin first and foremost. So priorities, I would say, is a challenge.
So are you seeing UK-based businesses with the skills and capability to carry out successful decommissioning projects effectively having their attention turned to other markets that are moving quicker than we're able to?
I think in some areas, yeah. I mean, there is the reality that there's always been some attention from abroad in terms of decommissioning. In many ways, seeing the UK as a centre of excellence and centre of expertise in some of those learnings. But other areas of the world are accelerating, perhaps faster than we are in some aspects. And so, as is only natural, a lot of the companies who have a good firm base in the UK and still want to be here are considering their options of diversifying and looking abroad as well for work. So we've got to be cognizant of that and realise that we can't rest on our laurels and assume that the supply chain is always going to be here. We need to make sure that we make use of the skills, the capability, the equipment and materials that they have, but we have to do that soon, in order to realise and to execute the work that's ahead, but also to keep that expertise in the basin long enough to do it.
This could be too detailed a question, but I'm going to go for it anyway. What is the most in-demand skill set and job role in decommissioning at the moment, would you say, in this market?
So I think the good thing about decom is there's a lot of transferable skills, which we do want to highlight. People who are in sectors of oil and gas and energy sector at the moment, there's a lot of roles in decommissioning operations where those skills can be fairly easily transferred or retraining available, and that's something we're keen to push. What I would say is an area that really needs focus is the wells. The wells aspect and plugging and abandonment is about 50% of the cost. So for the next 10 years, a 10 billion cost there alone. And in terms of the well P&A and the drilling skills, plugging and abandonment, that niche and expertise, whilst we do have that in the basin, it's an aging workforce with a lot of those skill sets. Trying to get young people and new people and talent from other industries and other backgrounds in to train for plugging and abandonment isn't necessarily as exciting, perhaps, on the face of it as some of the other opportunities. And the other important point there, I think, is as well as the decommissioning, plugging and abandonment, it's very similar skill sets to what we need for realising the CCS potential. The same people who are looking at plugging and abandonment of wells for decommissioning are going to be helping design and ready those for carbon capture and storage applications. So it's vital not just for decommissioning, but for the UK to really, unleash what it can in terms of this carbon storage opportunities. We need that skill set in particular in the well space.
So you and your organisation will be doing what you can through your channels to try and encourage and educate that future workforce towards this fundamental sector. Who else needs to raise their game somewhat to alleviate that challenge of talent pipeline and skills pipeline into the market?
I mean, there's a lot of good initiatives out there. We hear them talked about at most conferences and seminars. And there's different ways of doing that, whether it's targeting leavers from other industries, whether it's getting into schools and universities, offering the retraining opportunities. I think maybe it's not the lack of effort. Maybe it's just still the struggle we have with perception. In some parts of the UK, even in some universities and schools, oil and gas is still a difficult phrase, and decommissioning is associated with oil and gas, whereas energy transition opens a few more doors. And so selfishly, from a decommissioning point of view, I think we want to highlight, as I said earlier, that it's an enabler for decarbonisation. We can't get to net zero without it, both in terms of actually decommissioning the existing assets to reduce our emissions and to work towards that target, but also empowering the supply chain, building the skills and having the knowledge and expertise here to move forward. So I don't think it's a case of others not doing enough. I think it's still trying to break down barriers and common misperceptions and actually show that not only is it exciting, not only is there a huge amount of work ahead of us, but it's a real enabler for future energy transition projects.
Yeah, and we made a commitment at the last E-FWD event to bring forward more university members to the E-FWD community. And I think if you're watching this and you're working in the university sector, you must come down and join us at our next event and get plugged into our insights, because the trends that are shaping up the future jobs that your students and future students will need to be looking at for future opportunity are being discussed in real time in these rooms. And there are huge opportunities for growth and development in this sector that seem to be slipping off the radar and must be brought to the top of the agenda. Really interesting stuff. As you look forward then into the new year and you go back to those challenges into this year and you look to those challenges that you have, we started on, you had a list of 3, I think.
Yeah,
we talked about 1. Let's go back at that and let's make sure we tick off the list so we understand what the others are.
Yeah, so I think I touched on priorities, and that was looking at the competition, both from other aspects of the transition, but also from decommissioning abroad. The people, I think we've touched on, it's getting the workforce engaged, realising the opportunities that are there and making sure we can train and have that capability. Plugging and abandonment, P&A links to the wells piece. There is a challenge there for undertaking that work. From an NSTA point of view, we regulate the well consenting process and the well plugging and abandonment, and through stewardship we look to influence industry to deliver savings in decommissioning across the board. On the wells piece, it's a significant spend for people. It's an activity that we have seen pushed back a little in the past. Sometimes that's been for good reason, whether it's technical reasons or whether it's to realise savings through campaigning and collaboration, which is absolutely fair enough. And on a case-by-case basis, we still look at that. But the reality is that sometimes it's being deferred because there's a desire to invest the money elsewhere. There's been challenges to doing that. And from our point of view, we need to look at ways that we can come alongside industry and encourage them to deliver that more effectively. We communicated that through an open letter last year, and we've got some plans and some thoughts about how we'd like to listen to the feedback from industry on that and work together with supply chain and operators to see if we can actually start to map and forecast that out a bit more effectively.
And a lot of what goes on in the E-FWD sessions does sometimes involve a little bit of friction, which we say creates motion. And Nick Butler's stance on decommissioning was one of, well, hang on a minute, let's see what else we can do with this infrastructure first. Listening to you, what you're saying is there's a healthy medium between a level of necessitated decommissioning and other opportunities for use of that infrastructure.
Yes, absolutely. So from a regulatory point of view, NSTA and OPRED as well, one of the things we look at is, are there alternatives to decommissioning? And that's essential that we look at and we engage properly with industry. Reuse and repurposing is something that within decommissioning at NSTA is a strong focus for us. By that, we're still looking and still supporting recycling initiatives, but really the reuse and repurposing is looking at the existing infrastructure and saying, can this play a part in future developments? Now, that might not be as simple as, can we stick a wind turbine on top of a jacket structure that's been in there for 30, 40 years? But the reality is, particularly in the space of pipelines and trunk lines, there is a huge opportunity out there if we can marry up the infrastructure and when it's being decommissioned with where we see the carbon storage and potentially the hydrogen developments happening. A lot of those pipelines could be reused, and there are some topsides facilities that could be repurposed as well. We actually see it happening already a lot with FPSOs, whether it be in this basin or beyond, that do get reused for, again, oil and gas applications elsewhere. So we play a role in engaging with industry, trying to see what the opportunities are, matching up what's there in the basin with what we feel is being needed and what we have visibility of, and seeing if we can marry that up and move those opportunities forward.
We've talked a lot about what's to come, but tell me about some wins you've had over the last 6 months to a year. What are you most proud of getting through and achieved in recent time?
I think for us, we've just published one of our tools, data visibility dashboard, which is available on the NSTA website. So that kind of goes hand in hand with our Pathfinder tool. That was a project that initially had 3 operators on board. It's now grown to 15, where they've consented to having their decommissioning plan activities at a fairly high level visible on the internet for both other operators to look at and engage from collaboration opportunities, and also for the supply chain to see. The big messaging we keep hearing from the supply chain is they need visibility and they need certainty. The data that we have at the NSTA, we can play a key role, I think, with the visibility aspect, and we need to do that more and more. And with the certainty, that's something that we're trying to look at different ways that we can promote and encourage that, because ultimately we need that work to happen. We need to have a stable supply chain that's here to execute the work. We need to get it done cost effectively, and we need to make sure that it's a platform for success, not just here in the basin, but then exporting some of those skills and capabilities elsewhere in the globe.